Welcome back to Crimson Threads, the channel where we unravel the most tangled and shocking cases in history. Every family has its secrets, but some secrets are drenched in blood and ambition. What happens when the bond of siblinghood is severed by the cold steel of greed? Today, we delve into a story that seems ripped from a classic noir film, but the events are chillingly real. We're about to uncover how a pair of relentless detectives exposed a female heiress who orchestrated the murder of her own siblings to seize control of a vast family fortune. It's a tale of deception, betrayal, and the dark heart of human desire. Before we pull back the curtain on this incredible investigation, if you're a fan of true crime, gripping mysteries, and stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the cases we have coming up. Now, settle in, and let's travel back to the rain-slicked streets where our story begins. The autumn of 1923 in the city of Viridia was a season of contradictions. A persistent, melancholic rain fell from a perpetually gray sky, slicking the cobblestone streets and casting a somber pall over the grand, Gothic architecture. Yet, beneath this veneer of gloom, the city thrummed with the vibrant, chaotic energy of the Jazz Age. Fortunes were being made and lost in the blink of an eye, and no fortune was more vast or more storied than that of the Blackwood family. The Blackwood dynasty had been built on a foundation of steel and railroads, a testament to the ruthless ambition of its patriarch, Alistair Blackwood. His death 6 months prior had left a power vacuum and a colossal inheritance to be divided among his 3 children. The eldest, the stern and responsible Arthur, the free-spirited and artistic Beatrice, and the youngest, the quiet and enigmatic Eleanor. The first hint that something was amiss in the hallowed halls of Blackwood Manor came not with a bang, but with a quiet, dignified collapse. Arthur Blackwood, a man whose life was as meticulously structured as the financial ledgers he so loved, was found dead in his study. The cause, according to the family physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, was a sudden and severe heart attack. At 42, Arthur had been a man in the prime of his life, but the pressures of managing the Blackwood Empire were immense. The city's elite whispered their condolences, commented on the tragic fragility of life, and moved on. 2 months later, Beatrice Blackwood, whose vibrant canvases were just beginning to capture the art world's attention, was discovered lifeless in her studio. The official report cited an accidental overdose of laudanum, a substance she was known to use to combat the severe migraines that plagued her. It was a tragedy, to be sure, but not an entirely unbelievable one. The artistic temperament, it was said, often walked a fine line between genius and self-destruction. With 2 of the 3 heirs gone, the entirety of the Blackwood fortune, a sum so vast it could reshape the city's skyline, now fell to the last surviving sibling, Eleanor. She had always been the overlooked Blackwood, a woman of quiet tastes and retiring nature, who seemed more at home in the manor's sprawling library than in the glittering ballrooms of Viridia's high society. Her grief was palpable, her public appearances rare and marked by a somber grace that elicited widespread sympathy. But within the grim, stone walls of the Viridia Police Department, 2 men were not so easily convinced by the veneer of tragedy. Detective Inspector Frederick Mallory was a man forged in the crucible of the Great War. His face was a roadmap of past battles, both on the fields of Flanders and in the back alleys of his city. He was a man of few words, but his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missed nothing. His partner, Detective Sergeant Thomas Reed, was his opposite in many ways. Younger, more affable, and with a quick wit that often disarmed those he questioned, Reed possessed a keen understanding of human nature that complemented Mallory's methodical approach. It was Reed who first voiced the suspicion that had been nagging at them both. 2 accidental deaths in as many months, in the same family, with a fortune at stake that would make Croesus blush, he said, leaning back in his creaky office chair. Call me a cynic, Mallory, but the odds seem a bit long. Mallory stared out the rain-streaked window, his gaze fixed on the imposing silhouette of Blackwood Manor on the distant hill. The odds, he grunted, are what bookmakers and fools rely on. I prefer facts. The facts, however, were frustratingly sparse. Dr. Finch, a man whose family had served the Blackwoods for generations, was unshakable in his diagnoses. The coroner's reports, while brief, corroborated his findings. There were no signs of foul play, no whispers of discord among the siblings that had reached the ears of the police. Yet, the unease lingered. Their unofficial investigation began not at Blackwood Manor, but in the places where the city's secrets were traded like currency. The smoke-filled backrooms of private clubs, the hushed corridors of financial institutions, and the gossipy parlors of the city's matriarchs. Mallory and Reed moved through these disparate worlds with a practiced ease, listening more than they spoke, piecing together a portrait of the Blackwood family that was far more complex than the one presented to the public. They learned of Arthur's iron-fisted control over the family finances and his deep disapproval of Beatrice's bohemian lifestyle. They heard whispers of heated arguments between the two, of Beatrice's desperate pleas for a larger allowance to fund her artistic endeavors, pleas that Arthur had consistently denied. They discovered that Beatrice, in turn, had viewed her older brother as a stuffy tyrant, a man who valued profit above passion. And Eleanor? Eleanor was a ghost in these stories, a peripheral figure. She was always present, always observing, but rarely participating. She was the peacemaker, the one who would try to soothe Arthur's temper and calm Beatrice's dramatics. But some recalled a quiet intensity in her, a watchfulness that could be unsettling. The breakthrough, as it so often does, came from an unexpected source. A disgruntled former maid at Blackwood Manor, fired for sipping the family's sherry, was more than happy to share her observations with the detectives in exchange for a few dollars. Miss Eleanor, the maid, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, confided, "She wasn't the saint everyone thinks she is. Quiet, yes, but there was a coldness to her. She watched everything, everyone, and she spent an awful lot of time in the library, in the section with the old books. The ones on, well, all sorts of strange things. Herbs and potions and the like." This piece of information, seemingly insignificant, was the first crack in the carefully constructed facade of the Blackwood family tragedy. Mallory, a man who believed that knowledge was the most potent weapon in any investigation, dispatched Reed to the city's archives and libraries. Reed, a voracious reader with a surprising knowledge of the obscure, spent days poring over ancient texts, his search guided by the maid's vague description. He found what he was looking for in a dusty, leather-bound tome on Renaissance-era toxicology, a detailed description of a poison derived from the leaves of the foxglove plant. Digitalis, the text called it. In small, controlled doses, it was a powerful heart medication. In larger, unregulated amounts, it could induce a fatal cardiac arrest, its symptoms virtually indistinguishable from a natural heart attack. And, most chillingly, it was a substance that would be completely overlooked in a standard autopsy of the time. The connection to Arthur's death was immediate and terrifying. It was a theory, of course, a wild leap of logic based on the word of a disgruntled servant and a passage in a centuries-old book. But it was the first tangible thread they had. Their attention then turned to Beatrice's death. Laudanum was a common enough substance, but a fatal overdose, even for a habitual user, was not always a simple accident. They revisited the scene of her death, the airy, light-filled studio that had been her sanctuary. The room had been preserved as she had left it, a chaotic symphony of half-finished canvases, scattered brushes, and the faint, cloying scent of turpentine and opium. Mallory, with his meticulous eye for detail, was drawn to a small, ornate tea set on a table near the chaise lounge where Beatrice's body had been found. He picked up the delicate porcelain cup, his gloved fingers tracing its gilded rim. It was a small detail, one that had been overlooked in the initial investigation, but it sparked a question in his methodical mind. "Reed," he said, his voice low and resonant in the quiet room. "Laudanum has a bitter, unpleasant taste. Most people would mix it with something strong to mask it. Brandy, perhaps, but tea." They questioned the manor's staff again, this time with a more pointed line of inquiry. They learned that Eleanor had often prepared tea for her sister in the late afternoons, a ritual of sisterly comfort. She would bring the tea to the studio herself, a small gesture of kindness for her often distressed sibling. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, forming a picture that was both horrifying and, in its cold logic, undeniably compelling. Eleanor, the quiet one, the peacemaker, the overlooked sibling, was emerging from the shadows as a figure of calculating malevolence. But motive remained a murky, unexplored territory. Greed was the obvious answer, but it felt too simple, too crude for the subtle, insidious methods they were beginning to suspect. To understand the why, they needed to understand Eleanor herself. They delved into her past, unearthing a childhood spent in the shadow of her more charismatic siblings. Arthur, the heir apparent, had been their father's focus. Beatrice, the beautiful and talented artist, had been their mother's darling. Eleanor, it seemed, had been left to her own devices, a quiet observer in her own family. They found her diaries, filled not with the emotional outpourings of a young girl, but with meticulous, detached observations of the world around her, of the intricate power dynamics within her own family. She wrote of her father's favor for Arthur, of her mother's adoration for Beatrice, and of her own place, or lack thereof, in their affections. It was not a cry of despair, but a cold, analytical assessment of her circumstances. One entry, written shortly after her father's death, was particularly chilling. "The stage is set," she had written, "and the players have taken their positions, but the script is not yet written. I shall be its author." The words sent a shiver down Reed's spine. This was not the diary of a grieving daughter, but the manifesto of a master manipulator. As the chapter drew to a close, Mallory and Reed stood on a rain-swept street corner, the imposing facade of Blackwood Manor looming before them. They had a theory, a terrifying and audacious one. They had the whisper of a method, the shadow of a motive, but they had no concrete proof. They were standing on the precipice of a chasm, with the truth on the other side. To cross it, they would have to enter the gilded cage that was Blackwood Manor and confront the woman who held the key to its secrets. The game, they knew, was afoot, and in the heart of that grand, somber mansion, Eleanor Blackwood, the sole heiress to a blood-soaked fortune, was waiting. The decision to directly confront Eleanor Blackwood was a calculated risk. Mallory and Reed knew they were walking into the serpent's den with little more than circumstantial evidence and a growing sense of dread. A direct accusation would be met with a swift denial and the full, formidable force of the Blackwood family's legal team. They needed a different approach, a way to probe the cracks in Eleanor's carefully constructed world without alerting her to the true extent of their suspicions. Their chosen vector was a formal, yet seemingly routine, inquiry into the execution of Alistair Blackwood's will. It was a perfect pretext, allowing them access to the manor and its inhabitants under the guise of official, albeit mundane, police business. Blackwood Manor, upon their arrival, was even more imposing up close. It was a monument of gray stone and dark wood, a place that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. A severe, rail-thin butler with a face like a clenched fist led them through a grand, echoing hall to the morning room, where Eleanor was waiting. She rose to greet them, a vision in morning black. She was taller than they had expected, with a swan-like neck and a posture of unshakable poise. Her face, framed by dark, upswept hair, was one of classical, almost severe beauty, but it was her eyes that captured their attention. They were a deep shade of violet, and they held a stillness, a watchful intelligence that was both captivating and deeply unnerving. Her grief, which had seemed so genuine in the newspaper photographs, now felt like a performance, a perfectly tailored costume for the role of the bereaved heiress. "Inspector Mallory, Sergeant Reed," she said, her voice a low, melodic murmur. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "A formality, Miss Blackwood," Mallory began, his tone deliberately neutral. "We are reviewing the estates of several prominent families, ensuring all legal and financial matters are in order following a death. Your father's will is on our list." Eleanor gestured to a pair of plush armchairs. "Of course. Please have a seat. Would you care for some tea?" The offer hung in the air, charged with a meaning that only the three of them could appreciate. Reed felt a jolt, a flash of the image of Beatrice's delicate teacup. "Thank you, no," Reed said, perhaps a little too quickly. He saw a flicker of something in Eleanor's eyes, amusement, before it was gone. They began with simple questions, inquiries about the estate, about Arthur's management of the family's assets, about the legal counsel who had drafted the will. Eleanor answered each question with a calm, articulate precision. She portrayed Arthur as a dedicated but stressed older brother, overwhelmed by the weight of his responsibilities. She spoke of Beatrice with a sad affection, describing her as a brilliant but troubled soul, prone to bouts of melancholy. "It has been a difficult time for us all," she concluded, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "To lose them both so close together. It is a sorrow almost too great to bear." Mallory, immune to such displays of emotion, pressed on. "Your brother, his heart attack was quite sudden, was it not? Had he complained of any health problems prior to his death?" "Arthur was not one to complain," Eleanor replied smoothly. "He believed it a sign of weakness. He shouldered his burdens in silence. I believe the strain of managing the empire simply became too much for his heart to endure." It was a plausible explanation, the one that everyone had accepted. But Mallory was not everyone. He was a man who looked for the inconsistencies, the small, discordant notes in a seemingly perfect symphony. "And your sister," Reed interjected, his tone softer, more conversational. "She was a truly gifted artist. I had the privilege of seeing one of her pieces at the Viridia Gallery last year. A remarkable talent." A genuine smile touched Eleanor's lips for the first time. "Thank you, Sergeant. Beatrice was a rare talent. The world is a duller place without her color." "Her migraines," Reed continued. "They must have been terrible for her." "Unbearable," Eleanor affirmed. "She tried everything, but only the laudanum brought her any relief. I often worried she was becoming too dependent on it. I would try to encourage her to use less, to find other ways to manage the pain. I would brew her chamomile tea, hoping it would soothe her. But in the end, her pain was too great." She delivered the lines with a flawless, heartbreaking sincerity. But Reed, watching her closely, noticed that her hands, resting in her lap, were perfectly still. There was no wringing of fingers, no nervous tremor. Her grief was a mask, and it was beginning to slip. While Mallory engaged Eleanor in a discussion about the legal intricacies of the will, Reed's eyes roamed the room. It was a space of opulent yet sterile perfection. Every book was perfectly aligned on its shelf, every cushion plumped just so. It was a room that was meant to be looked at, not lived in. His gaze fell upon a small, glass-fronted cabinet in the corner of the room. Inside, a collection of what appeared to be antique apothecary jars was displayed. He casually walked over to it, feigning a polite interest in the decor. "A fascinating collection," he commented. "Are these family heirlooms?" Eleanor turned, her eyes following his gaze. "In a way. My mother was an avid botanist. She had a passion for the medicinal properties of plants. I maintain her greenhouse in her memory." "The Serpent's Garden," Mallory thought to himself, the phrase echoing in his mind. "May I?" Reed asked, his hand hovering over the cabinet's latch. A slight hesitation from Eleanor, a tightening around her eyes. "Of course." Reed opened the cabinet. The jars were meticulously labeled in a neat, elegant script. He saw dried lavender, chamomile, St. John's wort. And then, at the back, a small, dark glass bottle with a simple, handwritten label. Digitalis purpurea. Foxglove. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was there, right in front of them, hidden in plain sight. He carefully closed the cabinet, his expression unreadable. Their interview concluded shortly after. They had what they came for, but it was a double-edged sword. The presence of Digitalis in the house was damning, but it was not proof of its use. Eleanor could claim it was part of her mother's collection, that she had no knowledge of its toxic properties. They needed more. They needed to connect Eleanor to the procurement of the poison, to establish a timeline, to find a witness who could place her at the scene of the crime, not just as a grieving sister, but as a silent executioner. Their investigation expanded, radiating outwards from the manor. They revisited Dr. Finch, the family physician. This time, their questions were more pointed, more probing. They asked about the specific symptoms Arthur had displayed in his final hours, about the exact dosage of laudanum Beatrice had been prescribed. Dr. Finch, a man of old-world sensibilities and a fierce loyalty to the Blackwood family, became flustered, his answers evasive. Mallory sensed that the doctor knew more than he was letting on, but whether his silence was born of complicity or fear, he could not yet tell. They delved into the Blackwood family's finances, poring over bank statements and ledgers. They discovered that Eleanor had, in the months leading up to Arthur's death, made a series of large, untraceable cash withdrawals. It was a loose thread, but a thread nonetheless. The trail eventually led them to a dingy, back-alley apothecary in the city's most disreputable quarter. The shop's proprietor was a weasel of a man with eyes that shifted nervously from side to side. He denied any knowledge of Eleanor Blackwood, but a well-placed threat from Mallory and the promise of a lighter sentence from Reed loosened his tongue. He admitted to selling a potent, refined digitalis extract to a woman who matched Eleanor's description. She had paid in cash and had asked for a tincture that was tasteless and odorless. He had assumed, he claimed, that it was for a customer who wished to expedite a small animal's journey to the great beyond. The detectives knew better. They now had a direct link between Eleanor and the poison. The noose was tightening. Their final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected return to Beatrice's art studio. While the initial police search had been thorough, Mallory and Reed were looking for something different. They were not looking for evidence of a crime, but for evidence of a person, for the small, intimate details that would paint a portrait of Beatrice's final days. It was Reed who found it, tucked away in a portfolio of charcoal sketches. It was a drawing of Eleanor, but not the poised, elegant woman they had met. This Eleanor was different. Her face was contorted in a sneer of contempt, her eyes cold and reptilian. And in her hand, she held a teacup, from which a wisp of steam curled into the shape of a skull. Beneath the drawing, in Beatrice's elegant, flowing script, was a single, chilling sentence. "My sister, the angel of mercy." It was a revelation. Beatrice had known. She had suspected her sister. The drawing was not just a piece of art. It was a silent accusation from beyond the grave. Armed with the apothecary's testimony, the evidence of the digitalis, and the damning sketch, Mallory and Reed knew the time for subtlety was over. They had traversed the serpent's garden, and they had seen the poison that grew there. Now they had to confront the serpent herself. They drove back to Blackwood Manor, the rain lashing against the windows of the car. The final act of the tragedy was about to begin. They were no longer there as polite inquirers, but as agents of justice. And they knew that Eleanor Blackwood, a woman who had planned her ascent to fortune with the meticulous care of a master chess player, would not be taken easily. The confrontation that awaited them would be a battle of wills, a clash between a detective's relentless pursuit of the truth and a murderer's desperate last stand. The gilded cage was about to become a battleground. The final confrontation took place in the same morning room where their first, deceptively cordial meeting had occurred. This time, however, the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension, the air crackling with the impending storm. Mallory and Reed had not called ahead. They had arrived unannounced, their presence a clear and deliberate challenge. Eleanor, dressed in a simple but elegant deep purple dress, showed no surprise at their arrival. It was as if she had been expecting them. She stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, a figure of calm, collected defiance. "Inspector Sergeant," she said, her voice as smooth and cool as polished stone. "You seem to be making a habit of these visits." "Our apologies for the intrusion, Miss Blackwood," Mallory said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "But our investigation is concluded. We are here to place you under arrest for the murders of your brother, Arthur Blackwood, and your sister, Beatrice Blackwood." The accusation, so baldly stated, hung in the silent room. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not gasp or protest her innocence. Instead, a slow, chilling smile spread across her face. It was a smile of triumph, of intellectual superiority. On what grounds, Inspector? She asked, her tone laced with a condescending amusement. Have you found a signed confession? A smoking gun? Or are you simply relying on the fevered imaginings of a bitter, sherry-stealing maid? We have more than that, Eleanor, Reed said, stepping forward. He laid a file on the polished mahogany table between them. We have the testimony of the apothecary who sold you the digitalis extract. A man who remembers, in vivid detail, your request for a tasteless, odorless poison. Eleanor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A desperate man, I'm sure. A criminal who would say anything to save his own skin. Perhaps, Mallory conceded. But his testimony is corroborated by what we found in your mother's collection. A bottle of digitalis purpurea, the very same plant from which the poison that killed your brother was derived. He let the words sink in, watching her, waiting for a reaction. Eleanor's composure was remarkable. She simply raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. My mother's collection is just that, Inspector. A collection. I am not responsible for the contents of a hobby she pursued decades ago. But you are responsible for the tea you served your brother, aren't you? Reed pressed on, his voice hardening. Tea laced with a poison that mimicked the symptoms of a heart attack. Perfect crime, almost. No one would question it. The overworked businessman, succumbing to the pressures of his position. It was a narrative you carefully crafted. And Beatrice? Eleanor countered, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Are you going to suggest I forced the laudanum down her throat? My sister was a troubled artist, a cliché you yourselves must be familiar with. She took her own life in a fit of despair. She didn't take her own life, Reed said, his voice low and intense. She was murdered. You didn't force the laudanum on her, Eleanor. You simply encouraged her. You preyed on her vulnerabilities. You brought her tea, laced with a mild sedative perhaps, to make her drowsy, to blur her judgment. And then you made sure that a lethal dose of laudanum was close at hand. An accidental overdose, in a moment of pain and confusion. Another perfect crime. He opened the file and slid a photograph of Beatrice's final sketch across the table. But your sister was smarter than you gave her credit for. She saw the darkness in you, Eleanor. She drew it. My sister, the angel of mercy. That's what she called you. A chillingly accurate description, wouldn't you say? For the first time, Eleanor's mask of composure cracked. Her eyes, fixed on the sketch, widened in a flicker of genuine shock. She had not known about the drawing. It was the one detail she had not controlled, the one variable she had not accounted for. It was all about the inheritance, wasn't it? Mallory said, his voice a low growl. Your father's will. It stipulated that the fortune would be divided equally among the three of you. But there was a clause, wasn't there? A survivorship clause. If one heir died, their share would be absorbed by the surviving siblings. If two died, the last one remaining would inherit everything. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. You were the quiet one, the overlooked one. You watched as your father doted on Arthur, the heir, and your mother showered Beatrice with affection. You were a ghost in your own home, but you were smarter than both of them, more patient, more ruthless. You didn't just want a third of the fortune, Eleanor. You wanted it all. You wanted to win. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall and the drumming of the rain against the window panes. Eleanor stared at the sketch, her face a pale, unreadable mask. Then, slowly, she began to laugh. It was not a laugh of mirth, but a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. Win? She repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. You think this was about money? You think I went to all this trouble for a collection of buildings and stocks? You are as simple-minded as they were. She pushed herself off the mantelpiece and began to pace the room, her movements like those of a caged panther. This was never about the money, Inspector. It was about justice. My father built an empire, yes, but he built it on the backs of broken men. He was a tyrant. And Arthur was his perfect successor. A man with a ledger for a heart. He would have continued the Blackwood legacy of quiet, respectable cruelty. He deserved to die. Her gaze shifted to the sketch, her expression hardening. And Beatrice, my dear sainted Beatrice, the brilliant artist. She was weak, a parasite. She would have squandered her inheritance on fleeting passions and worthless canvases, a drain on the Blackwood name. Her death was a mercy, a culling of the herd. The confession, when it came, was not a tearful admission of guilt, but a proud, defiant declaration of purpose. It was the chilling, logical conclusion of a lifetime of resentment and a dangerously warped intellect. I gave them both the deaths they deserved, she continued, her eyes blazing with a fanatical light. Arthur, the man of finance, died at his desk, a victim of his own weak heart. Beatrice, the tragic artist, died in her studio, a victim of her own self-indulgence. They were perfect, elegant solutions to a messy problem. And I am the one who remains, the one who is fit to carry the Blackwood name. I am not a murderer, Inspector. I am a visionary. In that moment, Mallory and Reed saw her for what she truly was. Not just a killer, but a monster, a woman so convinced of her own superiority that she had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner to her own family. You are a murderer, Eleanor, Mallory said, his voice like a death knell, and you will stand trial for your crimes. As Reed moved to place her in handcuffs, Eleanor showed one last flash of defiance. With a sudden, swift movement, she lunged for a heavy, ornate letter opener on the desk. But Reed, anticipating a desperate move, was quicker. He sidestepped her lunge, grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back. The letter opener clattered to the floor. The fight went out of her then. Her body sagged, her proud defiance crumbling into a cold, empty resignation. The serpent had been defanged. The trial of Eleanor Blackwood was the sensation of the decade. The city of Viridia was captivated by the tale of the beautiful, intelligent heiress who had murdered her siblings in cold blood. The prosecution, led by Mallory and Reed's meticulous casework, presented an irrefutable mountain of evidence. The apothecary's testimony, the discovery of the digitalis, the financial records, and, most damningly, Beatrice's final, haunting sketch. Eleanor's defense team tried to paint her as a victim, a fragile woman broken by grief. But Eleanor herself, with her cold, unrepentant demeanor in the courtroom, undermined their efforts at every turn. She seemed to relish the attention, to enjoy the intellectual sparring with the prosecutor. It was her final performance, and she played it to the hilt. In the end, the jury took less than an hour to find her guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, his face a grim mask, sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led from the courtroom, her eyes met Mallory's. There was no remorse in her gaze, no fear, only a cold, calculating anger. She had lost the game, but she would never admit defeat. Months later, with the city's obsession with the Blackwood case having faded to a dull murmur, Mallory and Reed stood on that same rain-swept street corner, looking up at the now empty manor. The Blackwood fortune, without an heir, had been broken up, its assets absorbed by charities and the state. The gilded cage was now just a hollow, silent monument to a family destroyed by its own ambition. Do you think she ever feels a moment of guilt? Reed asked, his collar turned up against the wind. Mallory took a long drag from his cigarette, the smoke mingling with the misty air. Guilt is for people with a conscience, Reed, he said, his voice a low rumble. People like Eleanor Blackwood, they don't have a conscience. They just have an appetite, and a deep, dark emptiness where a soul ought to be. He flicked the cigarette into the gutter, its embers hissing in the rain. They had unraveled the crimson threads of the Blackwood mystery, had exposed the serpent in the garden. Justice, in its slow, methodical way, had been served. But as they turned and walked away, the silhouette of the dark, empty house a silent sentinel behind them, they knew that the darkness they had confronted in that gilded cage would linger in their memories for a long, long time. The case was closed, but the ghosts of Blackwood Manor would not be so easily laid to rest.